Hello, hello, hello. It's Laura Hockman, the medical
Hello.
matchmaker here. We have Danielle Wrenne as our guest today. Pretty excited for this one. So if you're watching it live, type hashtag live. If you're watching a replay, type hashtag replay in the comments. I'm going to get straight to it. Daniel is a money guy. He does the money thing. So I'm going to have him introduce himself in just a second. I'll tell you what attracted me to Daniel is actually that. So I was on his podcast a few weeks ago. And when we were chatting before the podcast, it was very clear that he actually cares about physicians and our well being. And I think a lot of us are taken advantage of by many people. So I'm pretty excited to meet Daniel and have him in my network. And so I'm going to have you, Daniel, just explain to us a little bit more what you do, what the official word for a money person is, and kind of what it is you do with us physicians.
Yeah, I kind of like money guy. We we're probably more like a money guy you would think of than like a traditional financial person. We so I've been in the industry for a long time, the finance industry, and started out kind of more in the product side of things, selling stuff, and over the years realized that was like a pretty conflicted world, and also realized I enjoyed working with physicians. And so in 2014, we started this business to basically exclusively deal with physicians and help them more with like just money in general, and not just like products, but like overall money stuff. And navigating that, and then also cut out a lot of the conflicts of interest that exist within our industry. And so we're a lot more like a direct primary care or concierge medical practice than we are, like a traditional financial services company. And we basically just help physician families kind of like navigate money. And ultimately, our goal is to help them use money as a tool to live better lives, not just to be like rich, but to kind of get to that point of like where they have balance and ultimately happiness.
Yeah, and I think that's a very common misperception, mis misconception. And maybe it's just because I'm coming at this from a primary care standpoint, but the rich doctor, I'm tired of hearing that one.
Yep.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the golden handcuffs. So tell us a little bit what your experience. What are the golden handcuffs?
Yeah, I think the traditional definition is like companies will create these benefits programs to like lock you in financially. So like they make it so good, or in other words, I mean they give you these really good benefits, but it's like basically like dumb to leave. Like it's financially dumb to leave. Like you lose lots of valuable things if you leave. That's like the traditional definition of the golden handcuffs. But like from the conversation we're having, I think, for physicians, I think of the golden handcuffs as like the financial situation they're in has made it like near impossible, financially speaking, to leave their job.
So how do physicians end up in this conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with. I mean, you have to think of like we're talking generals here, so like in general, you take out student loans on average, and it kind of starts there. And for a lot of people, that's a necessary thing. Medical school is expensive. And then you go through training, and that's super super tough, and you don't get paid a lot, and there's a lot of hours, a lot of commitment. But there's like kind of the hope there when you go into practice that pay is going to go up a lot, and that's true. um, but I think the problems really start to happen in that transition point when you go into practice. So you got the student loans, and then you get into practice, pay goes up quite a bit. Um, but I think the misconception there is that more income or the stuff that it buys is going to solve the problems that you have, make life good all of a sudden. And I've heard that over and over again for people that are in practice. They're like, they get the car, the house, the schools for their kids, like the country club, the whatever stuff. And I think the world tells you that's the key to happiness, but like people eventually realize that that does not equate to happiness. And in fact, it like locks you in. So what happens is you got the student loans, you got all these commitments, like financial commitments. that you've been kind of like been fed this like idea that equates to happiness, but really it equates to like lots of obligations. And when you have all these payments and commitments and obligations, that's where you become like super job dependent. In other words, you have to earn the check to pay the bills. And that's basically the golden handcuffs, because you can't, if you leave, you can't live your lifestyle you're used to.
Yeah, yeah, and I see that a lot. So basically, as soon as you come out of training, you go from a 50K salary, which is maybe a little bit higher now since I graduated a little while ago, but you go
Yeah.
from a 50K salary up to a 150, 350, whatever specialty you're in, but you bring your standard of living right up into that salary, and then you can't really, it's a lot harder to go down than it is to increase your
Yeah.
standard of living. So,
Especially when you're doing it on like fixed things like a mortgage. How one of the house is one of the most challenging things, because not only people think about the mortgage payment, and that's for sure fixed, but like there's all these other things that come with the house that like real estate people don't talk about and you don't talk about in residency, like maintenance and like furnishings, and the neighbors you hang out with go to the club and you end up at the club. I mean, there's all these things. There's kind of like baggage that comes with the house. So it's like almost like a fixed expense. And those are even more. I mean, it's one thing if you have travel, like if you're spending all your income on travel, that's a lot more flexible than a house. Um, and the least flexible is student loans, right? Because you got to make, I mean, I guess the minimum payment at least.
yeah. So
Well,
how
right now they're not charging payments, but anyway,
exactly.
that's
That's a story for another day. Um, so what would you suggest to avoid the golden handcuffs for physicians?
I think a lot of it is about you got to think like, why does this occur? I think a lot of it is awareness of it in the first place. Like, I don't think most people we work with don't like intentionally go that direction. Like, very few people, or maybe no people, want to be locked in. Like, nobody says like I want to get in a tight spot financially. And so I think the first issue of why it occurs is like just not having awareness that it's even a thing in the first place, and just kind of rolling with the flow. I think mindset is also really important. Like, you have to have th- there's a mindset that like, money is a tool, to provide to bring happiness. There's also kind of a mindset that like more money equals more happiness, like more money in itself. Like, if I earn a salary, I will be happy. Um, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot underneath mindset and beliefs and all that stuff, um, that I think that really can cause a lot of these issues. I think the biggest thing though is like taking the time to think about what's most important to you, because that is challenging as it is. But I think when you're in training, it's like when you work a ton of hours, 80 hours a week, and then barely have enough time to go see your family, you don't have much time to do non-required things like take an hour to sit and explore what's most important to you. Like,
Yeah.
that's just not, there's not a lot of time or no time for that. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing is like taking a minute to be like, hmm, like what's really most important. Because what I see when we interview people when they're just starting into practice, a lot of times, because we're the guys that are like, what are your goals, what's most important, like what are your values, how does this all prioritize? And a lot of times it's like, I don't even know, like. And then what typically people will say is like, my goal is to have $1 million, or have a net worth of $100,000, or pay off my student loans, or be financially independent by 55 or whatever. But then it's
Mhm.
like, well, why? Well, why is that a goal? And you kind of peel back the layers. It's like, you know, well, I want to be financially independent by 55 so that I can have flexibility. Well, why do you want to have flexibility? So that I can, do the things I want to do when I want to do it. What does that look like? And, maybe it's like spending time with my family or going to the sports game or, doing whatever. So a lot of times, so that's a good example, I think, because financial independence by 55 is the goal, but really the goal is like spend more time with family. And so it takes a little bit of like intentionality and like thinking through things to get back to that like underlying, value. And I think that's what I've seen to be the biggest missing piece of the puzzle is like, and I'm guilty of it too. Like when I was younger, part of it is like a life seasons thing, but like, we're just not great about saying like, hey, let's think about this. Like, what's most important? What are my values?
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, before I go on, someone just asked if this is going to be recorded. And yes, it is. So I'll post a replay. Um, but I agree with you. I've always felt that life is a journey, and so I'd rather work a few years longer and get to enjoy the process. And so, I've always kind of kept my standard of living a little bit lower to enable me to work part time or be able to spend more time with my kids. And and it worked out pretty well because when I started my company, a little over a year ago, I took a gigantic financial hit, but I had that flexibility to be able to do that because my standard of living is lower. I don't spend money on a whole lot, and
Hmm.
and I've been saving up because of that. So it
Right.
definitely affords a big financial, a lot more financial freedom to be able to do that by not having those large commitments. So
Yeah. But I mean, it sounds like you're in touch with like what's most important,
yeah, oh yeah, no, for sure, for sure.
which
Well,
is,
my
n-
kids, my babies.
I mean, yeah. And just recognizing that and then, having the courage to like act that out. A lot of people are like, yeah, my kids are most important, my family, my, whatever. But acting on that is another thing in itself. It's like, what I would say is like, let's look at your calendar and your checkbook really. Like your calendar and your checkbook are probably the best representation. Like everybody likes to say that, but like let's look at your time and your spending, what you're spending your time and your resources on. And that's what's going to really tell you what's most important. But you like took the action on that. Like you had the courage to like make a big scary change. That's the thing. These are a lot of times big scary changes.
Yeah, no, it's definitely for sure. And I think, my issue as well as probably most physicians is that we're so type A and so, very need to always keep doing more and doing better. And that's probably my biggest struggle is that, I want to be better and I want to give a better service and I want to figure out the zebra. So definitely does take away time from kids, and I need to just keep reminding myself. And that's what my husband does. He is always reminding me like, "Hey, you're preaching on burnout and you're pretty burned out." And I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah.
yeah." And then I know like I need to take a step back. So
Yeah. I mean, it's a lifelong thing. It doesn't, nobody, that's the other thing. I'm a big um, fan. I think it's super important to always be thinking about like, what's your purpose in life? Like, that's just such a deep question that
yeah.
it kind of goes along with like what's most important. But, you know, thinking about that will, no, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I don't really know. I kind of have ideas of what I think that is, but like it's an evolving thing and it changes a little bit and sometimes a
Yeah.
lot every time I explore it.
Yeah. It's different for everyone and even for each person, depending on where you are in your life for sure.
And a
Um
lot of times these goals, like these money goals, are kind of what get people into this position of the golden handcuffs. It doesn't necessarily. I talked about like expenses driving it earlier, but I think you can almost be in a similar position when you're so attached to your money goal.
mhm.
So I've seen it instances where people are hyper attached to like financial independence as soon as possible and they're basically locked into a terrible job because they have to have it in order to hit this financial goal,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, totally. I see that all the time. Well, so what are your thoughts on taking the job that pays the most?
I
I
think
know
that's
this is a
always
loaded
the
question.
best case. Just kidding. Uh, okay, well, That's not true. I was joking. In fact, I would say that's probably if I'm like looking at like the 3 jobs offers or whatever, and one's like a lot higher than the other 2, I would say that potentially might even be a bad sign. Like, I definitely don't think that's the best job, and I definitely don't think I think there's always a lot I think that's a very low, a lesser important thing, and maybe even a signal that it's a bad job. Because, like, if you think about it, like supply and demand, hospitals that need to pay a lot more, there's typically a reason. It's, maybe it's retention, maybe it's a less desirable area. Like, they have had to raise, they're not going to just voluntarily like give higher pay. Like, there's reasons why they're offering a higher number. Um, Especially job listings that have been on for a long time. Like, that's an especially bad sign. It's like they're paying the most and it's been listed for a really long time. That means they're having a really hard time finding somebody. And there's some reason why they're having a really hard time finding somebody.
Yeah. Well, oh my gosh, I see that a lot where, you know, physicians typically will say, well, this isn't paying MGMA data, or the MGMA data says, but it's skewed, right? The MGMA data is a little bit skewed, and
Mm,
give me a lower paying job that will treat me well any day over a higher paying job that I have to chart all night. I don't get to
mhm.
any say in how I practice or how the practice is run, or any of that stuff. And I agree with you. I think the higher paying jobs. I mean, I also know the behind the scenes of how they're able to do that a little bit, and I don't like it. So.
Yeah, it's not always the most ethical, and hours is important. Like, even your commute time is important. Like, if you got to go drive out into the middle of nowhere, like, that's a big deal, and you should
Mhm.
take that into consideration. Um, Also, like, I think I've seen it where they kind of, it's not, maybe it's not bait and switch, but it feels like that. So they're kind of like, here's this nice fat guaranteed salary, but then we're going to flip you to production based in X number of years. And the production standards are pretty high in order to maintain the guaranteed salary, which
Mhm.
further amplifies that whole issue we were talking about earlier, the golden handcuffs. That like makes it even worse, because now you got to hit these numbers that are probably, potentially too high, or, don't have enough time with patients, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes the doctors have to pay back if they, like, they have to write a check if they I don't see that too often, but I've seen that where the physicians have to pay a check back if they don't hit the RVU goals, which
Yeah, that's
stinks.
always unpleasant.
Yeah. So, what do you think as far as physicians' debt, the school loans, which are very large? What are your thoughts on paying it back immediately, or keep refinancing, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, student loans are, obviously a big thing. They've been in the news a lot lately. Um, I think maybe if we go through like the timeline, I think the first thing is being, I don't know if responsible is the right word, but like having a little more awareness about what you're taking out in the first place. I think I've heard many people say that, like, I just took out the max student loans that they were offering, and, were pretty loosey goosey with money a little bit. And so I think it starts on the front end where, like, when you're actually in medical school, like, you know, if anybody's listening that's at that point in life, like, don't, think about how much you're taking out and still budget and try to take out as little as possible on the front end. Now, most of y'all listening are probably through that, and it is what it is, water under the bridge. At that point, you got to pay it back in theory. um, Now it's gotten so complicated because there's all these like government programs and PSLF and forgiveness and refinance and all this other mess. Um, I think the forgiveness programs, they are a thing, and they're very valuable to a lot of physicians, especially PSLF. PSLF is huge. We have a lot of families we work with that are getting a substantial benefit from PSLF, especially right now, because they're not making you make payments. And so you like I think rule number one is you got to figure out like what does PSLF look like for you if it is a potential factor. A lot of people we work with in training think they're not going to be in like a PSLF type job, and then they end up in one. And then a lot of it kind of the reverse happens sometimes. So I would be I would be a little cautious getting out of the federal system right now because of all this, all the trends even too are going towards like more forgiveness, more, in favor of the borrower. Um, but basically like, if all the forgiveness stuff is not going to be a factor for you at that point, that's when refinance makes sense. Because I mean, the government normally charges higher than normal interest rates, but that's the other thing is they have not been charging interest rates lately. So refinance is helpful if the government starts eventually charging interest again. It's helpful because you can potentially get a lower interest rate. But right now is a weird time with student loans because it's like all this like potential forgiveness stuff. So aside from all that, like I think paying off debt in general is very good. And so you have to be careful. I call it like COVID forbearance creep. Like all this COVID forbearance stuff that's happened. What do you think people have done with the money that, I mean, the average person's probably spending some of it, if not all of it. And so that's more concerning than anything. It's like you need to be saving the money. If you're going for PSLF or you're holding out and waiting to see what happens, like that money needs to not be spent and put in a savings account for future student loans.
Yeah. So, where do you think people should be parking their money right now?
Not in cryptocurrency. Yeah, like safe money needs to be in like a savings account. The problem, or what's happened lately, is interest rates have gone up lately, and so banks are pretty often they're very slow to adjust their interest rates on their savings accounts. So banks make a ton of money when interest rates go up
Hmm.
normally because like the interest they receive goes up, but the interest they pay you doesn't change. Like this is the average bank I'm talking about. Like the average bank in local bank or like, brick and mortar bank, they're going to still be paying you a low interest rate on your savings, but they're going to be making a lot more money. So you talk to any banker, they're going to tell you we make a ton of money when interest rates go up. And the reason is because they don't adjust their yield on their accounts.
Hmm.
The way around that, like nowadays you can kind of work around that by getting like a high yield savings account is what they call it. And those are more competitive, like they adjust the rates faster. So at a minimum, like that's a much better place to have your savings is like in a high yield savings account. Like my savings account I use is at American Express. I like American Express as a company, and like for example, they're paying 3% interest right now. Whereas like the business account that I have, like the business savings account I have at the bank, is like 0.1%. So it's much better there. But it really depends on the goal of the money.
Yeah. So, what
Like if the
about
money's going to be parked for a day versus a year versus,
retirement money?
yeah, retirement money should not go in the savings account. Retirement money needs, well, I mean, unless you're retired. um, but like retirement money's got to, for most of us, we got to put it to work. Like we got to get those dollars working for us, and like savings accounts don't work very hard for us. But they're accessible, but like they just don't. There's not a lot of return from them. So typically with retirement dollars, you're gonna want to like start to think about investing, and tax shelters too are important. Like making sure you're maximizing tax shelters, making sure you're investing it. So that's like 7 podcasts right there, recordings in itself, more than that.
Yeah.
So that's a big topic, but like the gist of it is making sure your money's working for you and minimizing taxes.
There was an episode of 30 Rock where Liz Lemon says to Jack, who's, this wealthy owner of the company, she says, I want you to teach me to do that thing that rich people do where they make money turn into more money. So that's what
Compound
you do.
interest,
Yeah.
eighth wonder of the world. Yeah, I've been kind of into teaching my kids about money lately. I had a few podcast episodes on my podcast in a row about teaching children about money, and I got to interview like multiple different authors that have written children's books about learning about money. And so I got a few of these books and I've read them. And by the way, like they're amazing book. They're fantastic, like really for adults, I think, even because they teach some of these like basic concepts, like what we were just saying, like with compound interest and putting your money to work. It's meant to be for kids, but I think most adults could really benefit from learning some of like these basic, financial literacy type topics. And people always ask like, what book should I start with? I think I'm gonna. I don't know if they would get offended by this, but like, I think I'm gonna start suggesting the children's because I learned a lot from it just as an adult.
That's really cool. So I was actually looking for children's books on teaching kids finance a few months ago and didn't really come up
Mm.
with anything. So I'm going to head over to your podcast, like everyone should, Finance for Physicians, and I'll go find it there.
Yeah,
Um,
they're great. I read them myself, and I gave them to my kids to read, and they read them, and we talked about it. So we kind of took it through the ringer, and they checked out.
that's great. My one may be a little too young, but the other's ready. So when you work with physicians, what is it that you do?
Really, for starters, it's about kind of taking stock. I mean, everybody's so different, so it's never looks the same. Um, so at the beginning, it's like taking stock, like where are you at in life and money, and so um, I like to kind of break it down. Like there's two different kind of exercises we do on the beginning, on the front end, like you know, along the lines of taking stock. And the first is like getting all the numbers organized. Like what do we have to work with? How much, income, accounts, expenses, what's your budget, all of the taxes, all the numbers you think about. So getting all that really organized and in our pretty spreadsheets and all that. And then the second part is like kind of the goals and what's most important and your values. So that's more the enjoyable for most people conversations to have. Sometimes they're a little painful because you have values conflicts with your spouse, or like you're not sure what your values are, or you're way off track, or there's stuff that's kind of like you're uncomfortable about. But that's, I would say, the most productive part of it is like going through that. um, and that's where we see people struggle sometimes. That's what I was talking about earlier. If you have never done that before, can be challenging to go through, and it takes some time, and it's an evolving thing. But that's the second part, is like clarifying, like ultimately what's most important, what are your values, and then shaping your goals around those. And then at the end of the day, all we do is we just connect the two together.
You make it happen.
I mean, yeah, we just say, "Look, here's your money. Here's what's most important. Let's make sure they're aligned." And we use all the, efficient tools and all that kind of stuff. There's all these, tax stuff, ways to minimize taxes and places to invest and all that thing, but all that type of thing. But I think the most important thing is that you're aware of what's most important and are connecting your money to that. And I think that's the most common mistake too, is that people are not, whether they're not aware of what's most important, or they're just not doing anything about it, is that their actions are not in alignment with like what's most important to them.
Hmm.
And so we have to kind of call attention to that. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but
Yeah, live according to your values. So if someone's looking for you, they want to work with you, where do they find you?
you can find information about our planning firm. It's www www.wrenne financial.com. And then our podcast is financeforphysicians.co.
Got it. Thank you. Well, thanks for
Yep.
coming on. I hope that was helpful. If anyone has questions, feel free to post them in the chat at any point, and someone will hopefully see it and get back to you. I admittedly can never figure out how to see the chat from these videos on LinkedIn, but I know they're
Yeah,
there.
I'm not very tech savvy myself, so I don't know how much I can support.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. It was such
Yeah.
a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, always good to talk, Laura.